Hello friends, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Now it's been a while since I posted a video, and thank you for bearing with me. Tonight we're going to continue with the Kerbal Space Program NASA missions. So let's flash back to 1961 to 1962. Russia and the United States, the two world superpowers, are locked in the early stage of a space race. And so far the Russians have had the upper hand. They put the first satellite in orbit, they put the first man into space, and they put the first man into orbit. So far, the Russians have pretty much dominated, and it feels like the United States has been spending all their time catching up. Now, the USA had been scrambling to keep up, and tensions are high between the two countries, each flexing their military muscle and vying for world domination. Now, the United States has already launched two men into space, Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom. These were both suborbital missions lasting about 15 minutes each, and although Gus Grissom's capsule was lost due to the hatch prematurely separating from the capsule, the missions in all respects were very successful. Now at this point, both the Russians and the United States had put two people up into space. Both of the Russian flights were orbital flights, and both of the US flights were suborbital. But now the United States was ready to take the next step, and that was placing a man into orbit. And this honor fell to John Glen, a Marine fighter pilot who christened his capsule Friendship 7. Now, in order to place the capsule in orbit, the Redstone rocket was replaced by the bigger and more powerful Atlas rocket. Now, the Atlas was another off-the-shelf rocket designed to be an intercontinental ballistic missile, and it had an unusual arrangement. It had three engines on the bottom of the rocket that thrusted it off the launch pad, and it was called a stage and a half because the outer two rockets were actually boosters that were jettisoned during ascent, and only the center rocket pushed the capsule all the way out into orbit. Now, although there were 7 original astronauts selected, and all of the capsules carried the number 7 in their names, only 6 Mercury flights were made. The first 2 were suborbital, and the next 4, the last 4, were all orbital flights. That's because Deke Slayton, one of the original 7 astronauts, was found to have an irregular heartbeat called atrial fibrillation, and he was permanently grounded. Now, after being grounded, Deke became director of flight crew operations and was responsible for crew assignments until 1972, when once again he was medically cleared to fly. He flew into space in 1975 on the Apollo-Soyuz test project, docking spacecraft from the once rival nations USSR and USA. Go ahead and open this thing up. So here it is. Again, we got the 3 rockets on the bottom. This is my representation of the Mercury Atlas. Now let's go through part by part. At the very top we have the Mark 16 parachute. That's designed to bring the capsule safely back down to a water or land recovery. Now in the real world, the Mercury and all the space capsules came down in the water in the United States. In Russia, they all came down on land. Below that we have the Oscar B fuel tank, and that's going to provide these 3 LV-1R Spider liquid fuel engines, which are my equivalent of the retro rockets, with fuel once the rest of the booster rocket separates from the capsule. Below that we have the Mark 1 command pod. Now ordinarily on the Mercury capsule, the retro rockets were right here in the center of the heat shield, but because of the design of limitations of the Kerbal Space Program, that's not really possible, so I put my 3 rockets on the outside, as you see there. Below that we have the heat shield, followed by the TR-18A stack decoupler to separate the rocket from the capsule. I have an RC-001S remote guidance unit because once I separate my booster rocket from the capsule, I want it to come back out of orbit. Now, the real Atlas was launched and its orbit naturally decayed, and it fell out of space and burned up on entry. Unfortunately, with the Kerbal Space Program, the way it works, the orbits really don't decay. Once you get something out into orbit, it will stay there literally forever. Not so in the real world. So I have to actually be able to fly my booster rocket, turn it around and slow it down and have it come back to Earth and get it out of the orbit so we don't get cluttered up with a bunch of junk up there. Now below that we have an FLT-200 fuel tank, followed by an FLT-800 fuel tank. To give my remote guidance unit some power, I put a couple Z100 rechargeable battery packs on there, as well as some Oxstat photovoltaic panels to give them some power from the sun. We have another FLT-100 T800 fuel tank, another FLT-800 fuel tank, and then down at the very bottom we have the AV-T1 winglet, and our auxiliary stage and a half, I guess you could call it, the Mark 55 Thud liquid fuel rockets. They are a pair of them, one on either side, and in the center, the main propulsion that will get us all the way out into space, and that's the LV-T45 swivel liquid fuel engine. So let's go ahead and get our astronaut. Now, Jebediah is not going to fly this mission. We're going to take Luke Kerman. He's going to be the pilot of our first orbital mission. Now, when President Eisenhower started the space program and decided how he was going to run it, he said only military fighter pilots will be allowed to fly the capsules. And so civilians weren't allowed, pilots were not allowed, so everybody had to be a pilot. So I went through and I actually picked out pilots for all my flights here. So Luke Kerman's going to be given the honor of flying the first rocket out into space. So let's take it out to the launch pad now and get it going. Now, John Glenn entered Freedom 7 on the 20th of February 1962 at 11:03. And after several holds, he actually launched at 14:47. Now you can actually go to YouTube and hear recordings of the entire flight that John Glenn made as he communicated with the controllers on the ground. And I'll put some links to that at the bottom of this video. And you may recall that as he was lifting off from the pad, Scott Carpenter uttered the famous words, "Godspeed, John Glenn," as he launched from the pad. But unfortunately, John Glenn never actually heard these words. Due to a glitch in Glenn's radio, Carpenter's microphone was not on Glenn's frequency. So we're going to go through the usual routine to get this rocket launched. We're going to hit T to turn the stability augmentation system on. We're going to hit Z to power up the engines 100%. And now we're just waiting for the right time to launch. So all the engineers are pouring over their data. The electrical power has been juiced up, the liquid oxygen and whatnot, all the fuel has been put on board, and we are A-OK to go. And after several delays along the way, we are ready for launch. So let's blast off. Now I'm going to use my boosters to give me some support until I get to about 10,000 meters. And I'm going to keep going straight up until we get to a speed of about 100 meters per second. At that time, I'll throttle down a little bit. And we'll start our gravity turn. Now you can see that V in the center of the trackball. I'm going to try to keep that dot right on the edge of the flight path marker. If we go too far over, because of the new changes in the Kerbal Space Program, it will actually, due to aerodynamics, start to tumble and we'll lose control. So we don't want to go over too fast. So we're just gradually going to start to lean the rocket over. Try to get it down to an angle of about 45 degrees, 45 to 50 degrees. Now on the actual flights, they were inclined orbits, which means they didn't track the equator, which is exactly what we're doing right here. Our flight will pass over and over and over again right over the Kerbal Space Center because it's tracking along the equator. And the real flights didn't do that. So they had to plan well in advance exactly the timing on when to come back, fire their retro rocket so they would land at the appropriate spot. So we're getting pretty close right now to our goal of about 45 to 50 degrees. We're going through 7,000 meters. So we're just going to hold it right there and let this rocket kind of find its own gravity turn. Going through 9,000 meters, so we're just about ready to separate those two booster rockets. And now that we've done that, let's throttle back up to 100%. Now I've noticed that if I put much of the planet Kerbin in my field of view, up here my timing goes to yellow, and that means that it's struggling to maintain adequate frame rates. But if I kind of put it mostly out into space, you can see it starts to turn green, which means we're doing much better. So I'll try to, for the sake of keeping the frame rates up, try to keep that in the green as much as possible. So right now what I'm doing is just allowing the rocket to fly on its own and trying to get the apoapsis height up here to the same that John Glen had done. And when I scale that down to by the 70% factor because of the size of Kerbin, the orbit Glen had was 112 by 183 kilometers. So right now everything is A-OK, passing through 39,000 meters, and our apoapsis height is going through 100,000, so I'm going to start to slow that down. And when we get close to 112, we'll kill our boosters. So now let's go off into the map mode, and we can see our orbital trajectory. We're going to put a maneuver node here, and we all know the drill here. You put the maneuver node on your apoapsis, pull on the prograde marker. It'll show you in the yellow dotted line your orbit, and when the the yellow marker pops out on the other side like it did right there and starts to swap, you know you're in a symmetrical orbit. But we don't want symmetrical. We want to get this 111. We want to get that one out to 183. So we need to pull on this until that far marker gets out to 183. Too far, so let's back that up a little bit. So there we are. 183,000 meters up here by about 111, so that's exactly the scaled orbit that John Glen would have done. So now what we want to do is position our rocket so that it's aligned with the blue maneuver node right here. So if you hit that marker right there, it will swing around and align itself with that spot. Now in reality, the actual rockets burned until the fuel was empty. They didn't shut off and then restart when they were inserting into orbit like we do here in the Kerbal Space Program. They would just burn on a trajectory that would put them into orbit. And the way it was designed, they would naturally decay, even though they did have retro rockets, it would naturally decay because of friction in the atmosphere and whatnot. But we don't do that in the Kerbal Space Program. We once we get out into our apoapsis, we need to realign our spacecraft and then refire the main booster to actually insert us into orbit. So the drill is, our estimated burn time is 45 seconds. Divide that by 2. Let's call that 25 seconds on either side of our countdown. We will light the fire, and hopefully that will insert us in the correct orbit. The other thing I like to do is put the stability assist mode on instead of the maneuver node, because toward the end of this burn, the blue marker will start drifting off, and the spacecraft will try to chase that. If I put it on this stability assist marker, it will stay rock solid, and it doesn't care where that blue marker goes. Now, as we get close, I'm going to throttle down so I can be a little bit more accurate with shutting off my engines. Let's real quick go to the map mode and get rid of this. and see where we're at. So 107 by, okay, we still got a ways to go, so let's fire that up and burn until we get that out to about 183. There we go. We are now in orbit. We've got 111 by 183 orbit established. So there we have it. We have successfully put our Kerbinaut in orbit for the first time, and look at that. We've got Moon just over the horizon. What a beautiful picture that is. I absolutely love the graphics in this game. So right now, our mission is accomplished. You can see that we have burned most of our fuel. We should have enough to actually bring that back into the atmosphere by turning the booster rocket around. But let's go ahead and separate the spacecraft. And there we go. Our Mercury version of the Kerbin space program is now in orbit, and our astronaut is very happy on the inside. Let's go inside and see what he's seeing. Now, one of the experiments that the Mercury pilots did was trying to track the booster rocket after they separated, and they had various success. Some saw it, some didn't. You got to remember, they were looking out a very small window. Trying to find that booster rocket as they were flying around, and there it is. So we'll zoom in on that. That's our booster rocket drifting away from us. Very cool. So now let's just go back to the outside view. You can see the window that he's looking at, and he's looking down and seeing our probe flying away from us. Let's go out back into the map mode and see where we're at. Now what I'm going to do is actually switch over to the booster rocket, and I'm going to set up a maneuver node so that we can get that thing out of orbit. And you can see that the near node is way over here, and the highest node is 182,000. That's where we actually want to burn, because if we actually set up a maneuver node over here, we'd have to drop our orbit down from 182 all the way down into the atmosphere. If we do that just the opposite, do our burn at the high node, we only have to drop our orbit from 111. So what I want to do is drop this down to the point where that enters the atmosphere, which means bring it down to about, say, 35,000 feet or so. At that point, we know it's going to burn up in the atmosphere. It's not going to be able to stay in orbit. Okay, there we go. So there's our maneuver node. That's going to happen in 13 minutes. So let's just accelerate time until we get there. And again, remember, right now we're not flying the capsule. We're flying the booster rocket. And when we get within a couple of minutes, we'll slow our time down. We'll align ourselves with the maneuver node. And there's the space capsule out there, 5.6 kilometers away now. You can see that the booster rocket is now aligned with the maneuver node. Again, I'm going to put that on stability assist. And from this point, we can just fire up that engine, and it will come out of orbit. Actually, that was too long, so we're probably coming down much lower. So let's go back to the map mode, see what that did. Let's get rid of our... Yep. We burned for too long, so my problem. But anyways, regardless, it's still going to come down. And while we're doing that, let's see if we can... switch over to the Mercury space capsule, so we're flying it now instead of the booster, and we've gone ahead and done that. And there's our Atlas probe 2.5 kilometers away, and here's our Mercury guy. Now in reality he would be flying backwards, and nose down attitude of about 14 degrees or so, so something along those lines there. So he'd be looking at the world going by outside of his little tiny window. Now, John Glen's flight was not without interest or worry. He had a very uneventful first orbit. Things were going A-OK. He made his communication with the various ground stations as he went around the planet. At the start of his first sunrise, however, he noticed what he called fireflies. They were white, bright specks of something coming past his window. He seemed to think that they were coming from in front of his spacecraft, flying by his window, bright, fluorescent, and nobody could figure out what it was. Nobody anticipated that. Nobody expected that. He said it was like a big mass of very small particles that were brilliantly lit up, and they would swirl in front of the window and then kind of pass by and go on. Now, as he passed further into daylight, those seemed to go away. Nobody could figure it out. It was actually solved on the next flight, which we'll talk about in a little while. Now, at the start of his second orbit, ground control noticed that there was an indicator showing that the heat shield and the landing bag were not in a locked position. Now, when the Mercury capsule comes down, the heat shield on the bottom of the capsule actually detaches from the capsule and hangs down about 4 feet, and in between is a bag that helps cushion the blow when he lands. So this indicator indicated that the heat shield was actually not securely attached to the space capsule, and obviously that could spell disaster for John Glen and for the mission. Now, initially, John Glen was not told of the problem, but he began to suspect something was up when all the controllers on the ground told him to make sure that the landing bag deploy switch was in the off position. Now, at the middle of his second orbit, he started to experience some high temperatures in his suit, and when he tried to cool it off, he would get high humidity readings in the capsule. And for the rest of the flight, he was trying to find that correct balance between comfortable temperature in the suit and cabin humidity. Now, on the beginning of his third orbit, NASA decided that John Glen should keep the retro rockets attached to his ship after firing them. Now, remember, the retro rockets were attached right in the center of the heat shield. They were held on by straps, and they felt that if this heat shield was indeed dislodged from the capsule, those straps would help hold it in place. John Glen's no fool, and by the time that came to that point, he kind of figured that there was a problem with the heat shield. As it turns out, the problem was actually with the sensor and not with the shield itself. He was not in danger at any time, but at the time, nobody knew that. So he was told, keep the straps and the retro rockets in place after he fired the retro rockets, and so he did. And when he manually fired the retro rockets, he came back down. The retro rockets in the center were held in place, and as he was coming through the atmosphere and the plasma was kind of going around the ship from the heat of re-entry, he could feel the straps kind of break. In fact, one of them was flapping on the window. He could hear it knocking against the side of the space capsule, and it was right outside the window, and eventually chunks of it would fall off, and it really turned out to be no big deal. Now, during re-entry, just after he reached the maximum heat on the re-entry, the spaceship, Friendship 7, began to oscillate rather wildly, and he had to use a lot of fuel to help maintain that position during re-entry. Now, he decided to deploy the drogue chute early, thinking that that would help stabilize it, because in the process of trying to do it through the rocket motors, he used up all his fuel. So he decided, okay, I'm going to launch the drogue chute early. That's going to be my last chance to maintain control. And as he was reaching for the switch, lo and behold, the drogue chute deployed automatically. And ironically, it deployed even earlier than it was programmed to do so. So whether that was luck or if it was a fail-safe method, I really don't know. But regardless, the drogue chute came out. It did settle down the oscillations. And from then on, the flight was pretty much unremarkable. Now, after his landing, a destroyer came by and picked him up. And actually, he stayed in the capsule, and they put a line over the side of the destroyer, hoisted him up on deck, and he was originally planning to go out through the top of the spaceship, right through here, but it was very warm on the inside. He said, "To heck with this." He told the crew on the destroyer to stand clear. He actually hit the jettison handle, blew the door off, and in the process, it actually cut his hand, which again vindicated Gus Grissom. If he had done the same thing by accidentally or on purpose hitting that jettison handle, he would have had a bruise or a cut on his hand like John Glen did, but he didn't. So anyways, John Glen said, it was too warm in there, I needed to get out. Now, after his flight, John Kennedy, the President of the United States, deemed that John Glen was too valuable an asset to risk in spaceflight again. He went on to do a very successful and dignified career as a U.S. Senator representing the state of Ohio. However, he was eventually allowed back into space one last time on board the Discovery Space Shuttle mission STS-95 on October 29, 1998. He was a sitting United States Senator at the time, and he was the oldest person ever to fly in space at the age of 77. Pretty remarkable guy. Now, as I noted before, the first two Mercury flights were suborbital, and all the other ones were orbital flights. And next up was the basically the fourth mission, the second orbital flight, Aurora 7, piloted by Scott Carpenter. He, like John Glen, would do 3 orbits and then come back and land. Now, Scott Carpenter's flight was famous, or you could say infamous, for overshooting his landing by about 250 miles. There's a lot of controversy about why that happened. Now, Scott Carpenter's mission was focused on science, and he did the mission flawlessly. Everything went like clockwork. The only thing that got screwed up was the landing site, which he overshot by 250 miles. And at the time, people on the ground actually thought that they had lost him, that he had somehow died in the re-entry. He was eventually found. But he was able to solve the Firefly mystery while he was out into space. While he was doing some of his mission experiments, his hand accidentally knocked up against the side of the capsule, and in the process released a lot of these fireflies, and it turned out it was ice crystals that clung to the outside of the capsule. When you bump it, those ice crystals are released, and because of the size or the reflection of light off of them, it looked like fireflies going by. So the mystery was solved by Scott Carpenter. Now, Chris Kraft was the flight director for the space program, and he blamed Scott Carpenter for missing his landing site because he was not paying attention. And they basically had a feud for the rest of their careers, and unfortunately Scott Carpenter never went back into space again as a result of that. In reality, there was multiple reasons why that landing got botched, and part of it was because he was a little bit distracted. He had a very busy flight, as all the astronauts did. But he also had a faulty horizon scanner, which caused him to manually have to do control of the spacecraft, and he used up a lot of fuel. But the horizon scanner also gave false information to his computers, and as a result, he missed the landing site. But they did eventually find him. They scooped him up, and he was brought back in. Now, at this point in the space race, the United States had flown 4 missions, and the USSR had flown 2. Both the USSR and the United States had 2 orbital flights. The Soviet Union's flights were longer in time, however, but the perception was still that the United States was playing catch-up. But before long, it felt like, okay, the Mercury program is gaining momentum. They're starting to catch up, and things are looking pretty good for the United States space program. Now, for the next flight, it was piloted by Wally Schirra in Sigma 7. He was planning on making 6 orbits. And the United States was planning on taking the lead with the longest flight, the most orbits by a human being. But hold on again, the Soviet Union once again started the United States, and they launched 2 missions within a day of each other, and they had intersecting orbits. Now, there was a lot of consternation in the United States thinking, well, maybe they're going to plan on rendezvousing, something that we were planning to do with our Gemini program, but we weren't technically able to do that yet in the Mercury program. And thought was given to modifying Wally Schirra's capsule so that he would have the ability to incorporate some of the maneuvering and rendezvous capabilities that were going to be introduced in the Gemini program, but they said it was too late in the program, it would take too long, there'd be safety issues, and they didn't do it. But as a result of this, the United States actually took a second seat again to the Soviets, and the 2 missions that were launched lasted 48 and 64 orbits, so they blasted through that record by quite a bit. Now, when Wally Schirra was launched, his flight was textbook from start to finish, and Wally Schirra was one of my heroes from the original space program. He was just an outstanding pilot. He was really known for his technical abilities and the ability to fly the aircraft. So each Mercury capsule was allotted so much fuel from automatic and manual flying to complete their mission. But Wally Schirra was so precise that he only used a fraction of what was allotted for him. Now, Wally Schirra's emphasis in the flight was not science like it was for Scott Carpenter, but more on the technical abilities to maneuver in space and take photographs and things like that. All the astronauts were making observations on the ground and in space. But Wally Schirra's was absolutely textbook. Now, the Sigma 7 capsule can be seen at the United States Astronaut Hall of Fame in Florida. And oh, by the way, the Aurora 7 is now displayed at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. So you can actually see these actual capsules that were so huge in the early space program in the United States. Now, after Wally Schirra's outstanding flight, there was a lot of pundits on the ground that wanted to end the Mercury program on a high note. They said everything was so good, why should we risk botching things up and having disaster? But NASA really had it in their mind that they wanted to do a one-day mission. So that's what they did. The next flight was flown by Gordon Cooper. He had christened his ship Faith 7, and he made 22 orbits. He was the first astronaut to send live space pictures back to the ground, and he was the first American to spend greater than 1 day in space. And his capsule can be seen at the Houston Space Center in Texas. Now, when Cooper boarded his capsule, there was a little quote-unquote gift left for him in the capsule. Now, you remember back in Alan Shepard's flight, he had such long delays that the guy had to pee up on the top of the rocket, and there was all hell broke loose about whether they're going to let him out of the rocket, cause more delays or whatever. They finally agreed to just let him pee in his suit while he was still up in the capsule. Well, when Gordon Cooper got up there into his space capsule, he found a toilet plunger on the front seat, or on the seat, with a note that says "Remove before flight." So it was Alan Shepard's way of poking fun at the delays that he experienced, and it was all in good humor. Now, the last Mercury flight was launched May 15th, 1963, as I noted, by Gordon Cooper. Again, he was conducting many experiments while he was on board. Like I said, he was the first to send TV images from space back down to the ground. But his mission was not without problems. On orbit 19, he had a faulty sensor indicating that he was re-entering, but it was quickly confirmed that that was a sensor problem. He was not actually re-entering. On orbit 20, he lost all of his attitude reading, so he could not use his onboard computers to orient himself as he was flying through space. And on the 21st, there was a short circuit that left him without automatic stabilization. So what he had to do was actually draw lines on the glass or on the windows to help maintain his orientation while he was flying. What that also meant was that when he came time to re-enter, he had to fire his retro rockets. He didn't have the computers to assist him. Now this is to show the skill of these guys and how well they prepared and what their flying skills were like. He had to manually position his capsule and fire the retro rockets. He got a countdown from John Glen on the ground telling him when to fire the rockets. But using those lines he had drawn on the window and star positions outside of that small little window on the side of the capsule, he was able to maintain his orientation while he fired his retros, and he timed the retro fire by looking at his wristwatch. Pretty remarkable. Now, Faith 7 landed 4 miles away from the recovery ship, the USS Kearsarge. Of all the Mercury flights, with all the problems that he experienced in having to fire all of his retro rockets manually, that was the closest anybody came to their landing site. Gordon Cooper's mission lasted 34 hours, 19 minutes, and 49 seconds, and he was, at that point, the longest flight by any American in space. Now, one last mission was actually considered. It was going to be a 3-day, 48-hour orbit flight to be piloted by Alan Shepard. But at that point, expenses were not justified. The missions were all a success, and they decided not to do that. And with that, the Mercury space program came to an end. It had successfully met all of its goals, and that was, number 1, to put a man into space. Number 2, determine how man could function in space, because remember, there were all kinds of questions about his ability to experience weightlessness, disorientation, would his eyes be able to focus. We determined, yeah, you can do things out in space. And the third was to successfully bring the man and the machine back home, and that happened in all cases except for Gus Grissom's, who lost his space capsule when it sank to the bottom, was eventually recovered so many years later. So with that, the Mercury space program came to an end, and now it was on to the next challenge for the United States Space Project, and that was Project Gemini. Now you got to remember that this whole thing was designed as a stepping stone building block approach, with Mercury being the first step, and that was to test our functioning ability to get out into space and man's ability to function in space. The next step was to actually see if we could bring 2 vehicles together and dock them, because in order to go to the moon, we would have to rendezvous in space, dock 2 aircraft, transfer astronauts from one craft to another, have them go down to the moon, rendezvous again out in space, transfer them in, and then come back home. So it was a building block approach, and the next step was going to be the Gemini project, and that's what we'll get into next in the videos. But for now, we've got our Kerbonaut, Idlu Kerman, still out there on his first orbit. So let's go out and see where he is on the map view. So you can see he has gone almost all the way around the planet in one orbit. The Kerbin Space Center is this little dot right here, then this chunk of land that to me looks just like Africa. So let's accelerate time, because I'm not going to bore you with having this thing just float around in space forever. So here's the completion of the first orbit. Now you can see it's getting kind of dark there down there at the Kerbin Space Program. Orbit number 1 has just been completed. Now unfortunately, because of the difference in time between Kerbin and the real world, their days are 6 hours. John Glenn took off at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He still landed in daylight hours. That ain't going to happen on Kerbin just because the days are so short. So I'm actually going to try to land him over here in this bit of ocean. So now we're coming up on the completion of our second orbit. Once we do that, I'm going to slow things down again and set up a maneuver node so that we can get ready to recover our vessel. So we'll stop him real time right as he approaches the Kerbal Space Center. So basically we want to bring him down right about here. So what I'm going to do is have it so that we will fire our retro rockets just on the opposite side of the Kerbal Space Center. And again, we want this to get down to about 35,000 meters. Okay, there we go. Now where's that going to be? So that is actually a little bit too early. So let's drag that over this way a little bit. Now that should work. By the time our vehicle comes down and this thing shortens up. We want to land in the water over here, so let me just adjust that a little bit more. We'll drag it back this way to about there. Let's see where that puts us. I think that'll work. By the time our vehicle comes back into the atmosphere, this will eventually shrink down from 41,000 feet. In fact, we need to bring that down to 35. There. By the time that shrinks down and intersects the planet, it will track this way, and we want to land somewhere over here. You know what? We actually want to do it in daylight. That's still going to be dark. So let's move that back this way. Where does that put us? 21. So we got to go a little bit higher. Want to push that up to 35. Actually, 30,000 should work too. So that'll work. So now we can accelerate time till we get to that maneuver node. We can reposition our vehicle so it will align with a maneuver node. Now, for some reason, when I have the capsule alone, this will not line up with that node like it should. So we can consider that like a system failure, just like they had on the real spacecraft. So we will manually position it. Let's roll that wings level because I got a little bit of OCD. So let's go back to our capsule, and there he is, aligned right now with the retrograde mark, or the maneuver mark. So let's go back to the map mode. We'll accelerate time. When we get within a couple minutes of that spot, we'll slow the time down. And we'll bring our astronaut back, completing our first orbital mission in the Kerbal Space Program. Now from here, the flying actually gets a lot more interesting. You know, the Gemini program with rendezvous and docking was a pretty fascinating time. Plus, it was a vehicle designed by Gus Grissom, who was a fighter pilot, and he wanted the cockpit to look like a fighter pilot setup, and it was a cool-looking vehicle. And the challenges that were accomplished in the Gemini program were pretty awesome. Spacewalking, rendezvousing, docking, all those kinds of things. So that's going to be a fun part of the Kerbal Space Program. So now we're counting down to our retro burn. We can see moon out there in the distance. Kerbal out there. Short days when you're out in space, traveling at the speeds that they do. We're going to accelerate time a little bit more here. Sunrise and sunset happens pretty quickly. So when we get to 1 minute, we'll put it back on real time and get ready to fire our retro rockets. Okay, we got 1 minute to retro rocket fire. He is aligned with his correct re-entry position. And hopefully we'll come down in the ocean. One thing we have to do that's been a change in the Kerbal Space Program is you got to really pay attention to these parachutes now. It used to be you could deploy them at any time and they will come back, and no matter what, they're going to save you. They're going to open and stop you and you'll have a safe landing. But if you don't adjust these settings right here, you will end up having your chute open too late and you'll hit the ground going way too fast and you lose your astronaut and your spacecraft, and it's a disaster. So you got to remember to adjust those. Now that's new because of the changes in the Kerbal Space Program. So we've got 18 seconds to retro rocket fire. Now it's interesting that out in space you experience the same amount of gravity that you do on the surface of the Earth. You say, oh no, you're weightless. Well, the only reason you're weightless is because you're falling. And because you're going so fast, let me hit the retro rocket here. Because you're going so fast, the Earth is falling away from you at the same rate that you're falling toward it. So you are experiencing weightlessness only because the Earth is curving away from you. So let's fire our retros. And we'll go out to the map mode and see where that puts us. Get rid of that maneuver node. It puts us at 30,000, so we are perfect. We're going to come back at into the atmosphere, and atmosphere will then slow us down. We're going to speed it up until we get back in the atmosphere. So anyways, because of your speed, you're going around the Earth, but you're falling toward the Earth, and that's why when you look at it from the top, you're constantly falling, but you can see the curvature of the Earth. You fall, the Earth is curving away from you at the same rate that you're falling toward it. So you're experiencing almost the same amount of gravity that you do on the surface of the Earth. It's just you're falling, and that's why you're weightless. So pretty ironic concept. So let's go back to our capsule. Idlu-Kerman is passing through 81,000 feet. Now when we get to 70,000 feet, the music stops. Time goes back to 1. And we are now in the atmosphere again. So I'm going to align ourselves with the retrograde orientation. And I'm going to turn SAS off and let the capsule just kind of find its own alignment as it comes back down. Now aerodynamically, that's going to happen naturally. So again, I'm going to try to keep as little as carbon in the picture so that my frame rates stay reasonable. You can see the space capsule wobbling around a little bit as it's kind of finding its center, basically, as it comes down aerodynamically. We're doing some 2,373 meters per second. We're passing through 60,000 feet. When we get down into about the 52, 53 range, we'll start to see the effects of heat of re-entry. Now again, John Glen was not really sure that his heat shield was still attached when he did that. Turns out everything was just a faulty switch and everything worked out perfectly, and we're hoping that our Kerbal will have just as good luck as he re-enters. So about another 1,000 meters we should start to see the heat building up on the heat shield. And here it comes. That heat shield melts away and turns into plasma. It dissipates the heat of re-entry, protecting the astronaut on the inside. Now when you think about it, you know, he's sitting right here. He is just inches away from the heat of re-entry. But it did its job time after time, and no problems. So let's go on the inside and take a look and see what our Kerbinaut is seeing. You can see the planet down below, and you can see the streaks of plasma going by the window there. Knowing that the ablative surface is just inches behind his head. So let's see what our Kerbin Periaps is. It's passing through 25,000 feet. We want to land over here, hopefully, because that will put us down in daylight. But unfortunately, because of the position of our apoapsis not being at that, firing at that point, this is actually drifting away from us. So we may end up coming down in the darkness, which won't be the greatest video in the world, but that's okay. So passing through periapsis of 20,000 feet, 20,000 meters, I should say. Elu Kerman seems to be really enjoying his flight there. Seems to have all the courage and fortitude that Jebediah does, so big shoes to fill. And again, in the interest of keeping frame rates pretty reasonable, which they're still not. I was trying to keep Kerbin out of the window. So let's see where we're going to be landing now. Okay, we've intersected. You can see the impact point is actually sliding westward, so maybe we're going to land pretty close to where we wanted to, right over in this area here. So maybe we'll have some light as we come down. So let's go back and watch our capsule coming in. Now when the capsule's re-entered through the atmosphere like this, all that plasma generated heat and interference, so there was a period of radio silence where the astronauts could not communicate with the ground controllers because of that interference. So it was a pretty nerve-wracking period for the guys on the ground, not knowing exactly what was going on up in the air. Now up in the spacecraft, you knew exactly what was going on. But on the ground, they just had telemetry and other things, and they were waiting with bated breath, waiting for the guy to say, "Here I am. I'm back on the air. I survived." So this is still tracking, and we may be coming down pretty close to the shore, possibly even on the land. I hope we don't come out on the land. I really want to land in the water. We'll see. Now these Kerbin spacecraft actually land more safely on land than they do in the water, and I think it has to do with the physics of the water. There's like a rebound effect from the splashdown or whatever. That second splash or that second impact in the water actually has destroyed some of my capsules, and if you have men in them, they're going to die, whereas if they came down, same situation on land, they would have survived. So has something to do with the physics in Kerbin. So coming down on land is actually safer than coming down on the water. So we're either going to be very close to the shore or just barely in the water. I don't know. Hopefully we'll make it that extra little bit. Yeah, according to this, we're coming down on land. Rats. Okay, that's okay. Okay, we're slowing down now where the effects of the heat are slowing down. We'll be going supersonic though, and we'll see the white flame or the white vapor trail as an indication of going supersonic. Now as it slows down, this trajectory down here will get steeper and steeper. There's the supersonic vapor trails. Not quite going to make it to the water. So one thing we might want to do is actually have this altitude go up to about 1,500 feet, because there will be some terrain down there. We don't want to have it open so low with high terrain below us that we hit the ground too fast, so we'll have it open up a little bit earlier. The other thing that's been a change in the Kerbal Space Program is this indicator over here. It's red, saying that we cannot yet open the parachute safely. If we do it right now, it's going to fail. Once that red goes away and it turns gray, we're able to deploy the chute, and then it'll open according to the program that we adjusted by adjusting the settings up here on the parachute itself. So we're passing through 9,000 meters. We're going to be coming down on the ground, on solid ground. And we just had yellow and it turned gray, so we can deploy our chute. We'll say that that's our drogue chute. That will help stabilize the vehicle. And remember, John Glen's vehicle was oscillating back and forth, and the drogue chute did actually help stabilize it. And when we get down to about 1,500 meters, the chute will open. Must be 1,500 meters AGL. So here's our vehicle coming down on the ground. Unfortunately, it didn't come down the water. I really wanted to come down the water like the real things, but so much for my planning. And again, this is going to take forever if we just let it go at that speed. So we'll look at it from the ground view, so things happen a little bit quicker. Idlu Kerman looks cool as a cucumber. He actually looks the same color as a cucumber. Getting fairly close to the ground here. Our shadow should be over this way. And looks like there's our shadow way over here on the side of the mountain. Again, the frame rates are crawling right now, so hopefully this will be level enough that our spaceship doesn't roll down the mountain. And we have touchdown. Successful launch recovery of Idlu Kerman on our first Kerbal orbital spaceflight. So let's go ahead and hit F3. Total mission time was 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 55 seconds. Highest altitude, 186,186 meters. High speed over land, 2,208 meters. And the most G-forces endured was 6.7 Gs. Very cool. But let's go ahead and recover our vessel and recover our Kerbanaut, Idlu. He will be back in the pilot pool ready for his next assignment. So he is done. We're back. It's nighttime at Kerbin, and I appreciate your watching. Thanks for bearing with me, and we'll see you soon with the next flight on the Kerbal Space Program. That will be starting the Gemini missions. I'm going to go ahead and fly all the other Mercury missions, but I'm not going to make videos of those. So we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.